Hi again. Sorry that that last piece of the lecture was cut short there. I ran out of time, and it finished before I realised. So I just want to continue and finish off, as you said, the last lecture. I wanted to get through very briefly a brief history of youth work in a British context. So I'm going to continue on. So this is the last slide that I finished with, and just to say, so when we're looking at what Jefferson Smith were saying. Youth work was born and remains fundamentally a part of civil society, wrapped up with associational life, community groups and voluntary organisations. And I just made a note, and I know we're talking about British context, but when you look at that definition of youth work, you can very much see the way youth work is in Ireland, and when we look at the Irish context of youth work as well. So the fact that it is part of civil society, wrapped up in association life, community groups, voluntary organisations, this is what we see in Ireland at the moment, and this is also defined in law. So moving on then, so Davies and Smith looks at youth work in the 1960s and 1970s, okay, so this is Bernard Davies and Mark Smith, okay. So after the Second World War, there was, like we said, the discovery then of teenagers, okay, so from the Industrial Revolution into into World War II, there was this movement towards there being a teenager, towards there being adolescence, and by the time it got to the 50s, the 60s in the UK, you could see the evolution of the teenager. You could see it in the music, in the pop culture, and some of you might have read a little bit about this already. You had things like the Mods and the Rockers and the Teddy Boys. So teenagers were trying to carve out an identity for themselves by the time it got to the 1950s and 1960s, and were very much seen as a particular social grouping within society. So in the 1960s, there was something called the Albemarle Report was published. So this, as it says there, this report famously declared that the primary aims of the youth service should be association, training and challenge. Okay, this report was really important because it really identified there to be a need for youth work and there to be provision for young people outside of school. So it was a really important report in regard to the growth of youth work within a UK context, within a British context, okay, and supported what was dubbed, as Davies and Smith have called, the golden age of youth work in England and Wales. So youth work really thrived and really progressed during the 1960s and 1970s because of there being quite a lot of investment into it, which was supported by the Albemarle report that was published in the 1960s. So significant spending was triggered on youth work, and also a lot of, like that last point says, there was a lot of literature created around youth work, what youth work looks like, recording what's happening in youth work, and people just taking more of a vested interest in youth work and writing about it and talking about it and being part of youth work, okay? So into the 1970s then, Britain saw a bulge in young people, okay, and this started to drop then later in the 70s, okay, so there was actually, so the 1960s, early 70s, there was a lot of young people, and this, so obviously then there was a lot of young people accessing youth work, needed youth work services, but what they saw was that this started to drop then in the later 70s, that there was a demographic drop in young people, that less young people, in fact, were actually accessing youth work services and therefore coming into youth clubs. So questions arose around this in regard to, so, young people aren't coming to youth clubs anymore. Well, what are they doing? And again, what was prompting young people not to come to youth clubs anymore? So there was a lot of young people accessing services, late 60s, early 70s. By the late 70s, early 80s, young people weren't coming out and going into youth clubs as much. So what was this about? What questions arose as to why this was happening? Well, this pointed people towards, people started to look at what was happening. Well, what was happening in houses at the time? So the late 70s, the early 80s, as most of us know, there was more televisions in houses, VCRs, so more entertainment was available for people within their houses. Therefore, they didn't have to access things like youth clubs as much, and they were staying in more. So people working in youth work and volunteering in youth work started to think about how can we start doing youth work again with young people? How can we start working with young people, but in a different way than we have been in the youth clubs? How do we get them back into youth work? Maybe we have to look at different models of doing this again. So this is what they did. So in the 1980s, first off, there was pressure on state funding. So this is number two, why there was issues, challenges to youth work in the late 70s and 80s. So one, young people had more entertainment at hand in their homes and more commercial activities, and had a bit more money to do these commercial activities. Two, there was pressure on state funding, and the money that had been put into the youth service in the 60s and 70s was starting to decline slightly into more focused youth work. So there was a lot of money being invested in youth work in the 60s and 70s, and this was mainstream youth work, youth clubs, youth workers, this sort of thing. So the late 70s and the late 80s saw this being pulled back slightly, and the money being prioritised into other areas. So we want you to work with young people, but you know what, we want you to do particular things with particular young people around things like, as you see, criminal justice. Okay, so we'll give you money, but we're asking you to use it with particular young people who, for example, might be getting in trouble with the law. There was a continued demographic drop in young people also. So like that, youth workers, professional, voluntary, needed to look at alternative approaches, alternative models to be able to continue to work with young people in a mainstream and a focused way. So there was a move to detached youth work, so moving outside the youth clubs and moving into other areas, doing youth work outside of community buildings. And there's also a growth of issue-based projects, so particular projects being set up like that, maybe to address things like criminal justice or different aspects of society. So these issue-based projects were also set up. So it wasn't just the mainstream youth clubs that everyone could access anymore. And then in Scotland, there was setting up of things like youth cafes for young people. Okay, so these all started to come to the fore the mid to the late 80s, these new ways of providing for young people along with mainstream youth clubs. Okay, so youth workers had to look outside the box and had to look at how they could continue to work with young people. In order for them to maintain funding, so like we said, during the 80s, less funding was being put in. There was less funding there to be put into youth work. So there was a shift from open provision, so this mainstream youth work, like I said, to young people deemed at risk. So the criminal justice aspect and provision for young people who might be living in disadvantaged areas grew more. So the 1990s then saw a shift in policy where money was being provided to services for youth as opposed to a youth service. So like we said, issue-based projects, that money was being given for particular types of youth as opposed to there just being a service there for all young people. More and more workers spending time doing paperwork and coordinating activities rather than being part of the process, building those relationships, going back to those values of youth work. Youth workers were more so focused on organising activities for young people rather than being part of and building that process with the young people. There was more one-to-one and casework involved as opposed to working with groups. And the role of youth work was to an extent in the British context downgraded and marginalised then. So whereas the 1960s, 1970s had seen it thrive, the 1990s saw a drop in the funding that was being given to it, which refocused youth work's purpose and therefore reshifted it to a different place in society. So we'll come back to Britain then in the next lecture when we look at where youth work has been in Ireland, Britain and Greece in the past 10 years and up to the present. So I suppose just to recap, we had Britain, that during the 1960s and 1970s, the Albemarle report highlighted how important working with young people was, and all young people, and this saw a thriving of youth work within a British context during the 1960s, 1970s, where a lot of youth workers were employed. It came under, it was a statutory service, and there was a lot of provision for young people. This declined then in the late 1970s, late 1980s, due to less money being put into it, and also a lot more entertainment being accessed by young people at home, so they weren't coming out of their houses as much. So there was a few things happening at a societal level in regard to what influenced youth work to change around again. And by the 1970s, we see this refocus of youth work and its work with particular types of young people, and its move from being a service for all young people to a service for particular young people. So we'll have a look at that more. So if you can just try the quiz that applies to the past couple of lectures that you've watched that have been recorded, and we'll move on then to the next lecture. Thanks very much.